There's a statistic from the Vietnam War that sounds almost impossible to believe. During the height of the conflict, amidst the bloody fighting of 1968, the estimated life expectancy of a rookie door gunner in a hot landing zone was rumored to be roughly 13 seconds. While that number might be a grim exaggeration of soldier folklore, the reality was not far off. Being a door gunner on OH-1 Huey was widely considered one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire United States military. It was a job where you didn't hide from the enemy, you dangled your legs out of an open door and invited them to shoot at you. You were the bait, the eyes, and the hammer of the Air Cavalry. Imagine this. You are flying at 90 knots, suspended 1,500 feet above a triple canopy jungle. The enemy can hear your helicopter coming from 5 miles away. To them, you are not a soldier, you are a loud, slow-moving silhouette against the bright sky. You are sitting in an aluminum box with skin so thin you could puncture it with a screwdriver. And your only protection against the thousands of AK-47 rounds coming up from the trees is a ceramic vest, a steel helmet you are sitting on, and a 23-pound machine gun tied to the ceiling with a bungee cord. Welcome to the suicide seat. To understand why this role was so lethal, you have to understand the physics of the Vietnam War. The helicopter changed everything. It allowed American troops to go anywhere, anytime. But it also meant that the helicopter crews were constantly thrust into the center of the kill zone. The North Vietnamese Army and VA and the Viet Cong quickly learned a simple lesson. If you kill the machine gunner, the helicopter is blind. If you kill the helicopter, the infantry is stranded. As a result, NVA commanders offered bounties and promotions for shooting down American choppers, and the easiest target on a chopper was the man hanging out the side. The door gunner wasn't always a trained aviation specialist. Often, they were regular infantry grunts, 19-year-old draftees who volunteered for flight duty. The reasons varied. Some wanted the extra $55 a month in flight pay. Others figured that flying above the jungle was better than marching through the mud and leeches below. They didn't realize they were trading landmines for anti-aircraft fire. The tool of their trade was the M60 General Purpose Machine Gun. Known as the PEG, it was a heavy, temperamental beast firing 7.6mm NATO rounds. But in the hands of a door gunner, it was modified into a weapon of terrifying efficiency. Standard military doctrine stated the M60 should be mounted on a fixed pintle post, limiting its movement. The gunners hated this. A fixed gun meant you had blind spots where the enemy could hide. So, American soldiers did what they always do. They improvised. They invented the free gun setup. They stripped the M60 off the rigid mount. To support the heavy weapon, they used a heavy-duty industrial bungee cord hooked to the ceiling of the helicopter. This allowed the gunner to swing the weapon freely. He could lean dangerously far out of the aircraft, secured only by a monkey strap around his waist, and fire directly vertically at an enemy hiding in a spider hole right below the skids. But this freedom came with a price. By leaning out, the gunner exposed his entire body to the slipstream and the enemy fire. There was no armored glass. There was no steel plating. Just a man, a gun, and the open air. The ingenuity of the gunners didn't stop at the mount. The M60 was notorious for jamming when the ammunition belts twisted in the fierce wind of the open cabin. A jammed gun in a firefight meant death. The solution? An empty C-ration can, usually the one that held peaches or fruit cocktail. The gunners would wire this empty tin can to the side of the machine gun. The ammo belt would glide smoothly over the curved metal surface of the can, preventing snags. It was a 10-cent piece of trash that saved countless lives. Protection was a myth. The pilots in the front sat in armored bucket seats. The gunners in the back had nothing. The floor of the Huey was made of thin magnesium alloy. A bullet fired from the ground would punch through the floor like paper. This led to the universal, superstitious, and highly practical habit of sitting on the helmet. Standard issue steel helmets were uncomfortable to wear with aviation headsets, so gunners took them off and sat on them. They knew that a bullet coming up through the floor would likely hit the femoral artery or the groin. Sitting on the steel pot was the only armor they had for their most vital areas. The job required a special kind of psychological endurance. A sniper shoots to kill a specific target. A door gunner shoots to suppress a whole area. The goal was to make the enemy keep their heads down so the helicopter could land. This meant firing thousands of rounds into the tree line, but the enemy shot back, and they used green tracers. American bullets glowed red, communist bullets glowed green. Veterans speak of the terror of seeing green streaks of light floating slowly up from the dark jungle, only to zip past their faces at supersonic speeds. It was a deadly light show. One of the most terrifying threats wasn't even a bullet. It was the RPG rocket-propelled grenade. The Viet Cong learned that if you fired an RPG at a hovering helicopter, the explosion didn't need to be a direct hit. The shrapnel alone could shred the rotor blades or kill the exposed crew in the back. Door gunners had to scan the tree lines constantly for the puff of smoke that signaled a launch. If they saw it, they had split seconds to scream "break right" into the intercom before the rocket arrived. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, a unique culture formed among the gunners. They painted graffiti on their helmets. They customized their flight suits. They were the rock stars of the war, blasting Jimi Hendrix or Creedence Clearwater Revival through the internal communication system while flying into battle. They were the Air Cavalry, and for the infantry pinned down in the mud below, the sound of their M60s was the sound of salvation, but the bravado masked a deep fear. Every time they strapped in, they knew the odds. They knew that in a Hot LZ, they were the first thing the enemy would see, and the first thing the enemy would try to kill. This is the story of the men who rode the Dragon, the men who hung out of the open doors of a Huey, armed with a bungee-corded machine gun and a fruit can, fighting a war at 100 miles per hour. If the technology of the helicopter defined the Vietnam War, it was the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley in November 1965 that wrote the rule book for the door gunner. This was the first major engagement between the United States Army and the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN. It was the test of the airmobile concept. The 1st Cavalry Division, under Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, dropped into LZ X-Ray, a small clearing at the foot of the Chupong Massif, for the door gunners of the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion. The Ia Drang was a baptism by fire that bordered on insanity. The landing zone was not just hot, it was an inferno. As the Slicks troop transports flared to land, they were met by a wall of fire from 3 NVA battalions entrenched in the surrounding high grass and termite mounds. Here, the role of the door gunners shifted from support to survival. The gunners were the only thing keeping the LZ open. As the skids touched the tall elephant grass, the gunners had to maintain a continuous wall of lead, a curtain of steel around the aircraft, to prevent the enemy from rushing the helicopter. They were firing their M60s with one hand, while using the other to physically kick crates of ammunition and medical supplies out the door to the besieged infantry. It was in the Ia Drang that the terrifying reality of the turnaround became clear. The pilots, led by Major Bruce Crandall, callsign Ancient Serpent 6, flew into the kill zone not once but repeatedly. For a door gunner, this was psychological torture. You would fly into the gunfire, unload, take off, fly back to base, reload, and then willingly go back into the same trap again and again. 14, 15, 16 times in a single day. The floorboards of the Hueys became so slick with the blood of the wounded. They were evacuating that gunners had to sprinkle sand or dirt on the metal just to keep their footing while firing. But while the mass air assaults of the First Cav were the headline battles, a different, lonelier, and far deadlier war was being fought by the Scouts. This was the domain of the pink teams, the hunter-killer groups. If being a gunner on a Huey was dangerous, being a gunner on an OH-6 Cayuse, the Loach, was essentially a death wish. The Loach was a tiny, teardrop-shaped observation helicopter. It was fast, agile, and incredibly fragile. The tactic of the pink team was brutal in its simplicity. The Loach, the white bird, would fly low, terrifyingly low, skimming just feet above the jungle canopy, or even weaving between the trees. Its job was to draw fire, to be the bait. The door gunner on a Loach didn't have a bungee cord or a heavy mount. He was often crammed into the tiny rear compartment, legs hanging out, armed with an M60 or sometimes just a carbine and a box of grenades. His job was to stare into the green abyss below and wait for a muzzle flash. When the enemy fired at the Loach, the gunner would mark the target with smoke or tracers and return fire desperately, while the pilot yanked the tiny helicopter into a bray. Then came the red bird. High above, circling like a vulture, waited the UH-1 Cobra gunship. Once the Loach exposed the enemy position, the Cobra rolled in, unleashing 2.75-inch rockets and minigun fire that turned the jungle into sawdust. For the gunner on the Loach, success meant getting shot at. It was a game of Russian roulette played at 100 knots. The survival rate for scout gunners was abysmal. They were the eyes of the division, but the enemy knew that if you blinded the scout, the Cobra couldn't find you. The environment inside the helicopter during these engagements was a sensory overload that no movie has ever accurately captured. It wasn't just the noise, it was the brownout. When a flight of helicopters lands in dry season, the rotor wash kicks up a massive cloud of red dust. Visibility drops to zero. The pilots are flying on instruments and instinct. The door gunner is suddenly blind, wrapped in a choking red fog. Yet, he must keep firing. He fires into the dust, aiming at muzzle flashes he can barely see, praying he isn't shooting his own troops who might have shifted position in the chaos. The dust coats everything: the gun, the ammo belts, the eyes, the lungs. M60s would jam as the grit mixed with the gun oil, turning it into an abrasive paste. Gunners would frantically pour LSA lubricants, small arms, or even water from their canteens onto the receiver of the burning hot gun just to keep it cycling. And then there was the night. Night operations in Vietnam were a psychedelic nightmare. The US military relied on spooky or Puff the Magic Dragon C-47 gunships dropping flares to illuminate the battlefield. Under the drifting, sputtering light of a million candle power flare, the jungle cast long, dancing shadows. For the door gunner, the night was a duel of tracers. The NVA used green tracers. The Americans used red. In a heavy firefight, the sky looked like a laser show, but the tracers worked both ways. A gunner firing a continuous stream of red tracers was drawing a line in the sky that pointed exactly to his chest. Experienced gunners learned to break the link to remove the tracer rounds from their ammo belts entirely. They learned to aim by instinct, by the splash of dust where the bullets hit, or by the muzzle flash. They became ghosts in the dark, denying the enemy a point of aim. But no matter how skilled the gunner, there was always the threat of the golden BB. This was the pilot's term for the single, lucky bullet that could bring down $1 million aircraft. It didn't take a missile. A single AK-47 round hitting the tail rotor drive shaft would cause the Huey to spin violently out of control. A hit to the transmission, the Jesus nut assembly, meant the main rotor could detach. When a Huey went down, the gunners were changed instantly. If they survived the crash, a violent, bone-breaking impact often followed by fire as the JP for fuel tanks ruptured. They were no longer aviators. They were infantrymen, but without the support of a platoon. Standard procedure for a crash landing in hostile territory was frantic. The gunner had to cut himself out of his harness if the release mechanism was jammed. Grab his M60, and this was critical, strip the remaining ammunition belts from the feeder. A downed helicopter crew was a high-value prize for the Viet Cong. The M60, which had been a mounted weapon a minute ago, was now a heavy, cumbersome ground weapon. The gunner would wrap the ammo belts around his torso, Pancho Villa style, and set up a defensive perimeter near the wreckage to protect the injured pilots. Many medals of honor were earned not in the air, but in the mud next to the burning skeleton of a Huey, holding off a company of NVA soldiers with a salvaged machine gun. The psychological toll of this job was unique. Unlike the infantry, who stayed in the jungle for weeks, the door gunner lived a schizophrenic existence. In the morning, he might be eating hot eggs and drinking coffee at base camp. By noon, he might be washing the blood of a 19-year-old kid off the diamond plate floor of his helicopter. By evening, he was back at the base, drinking a beer at the O Club, trying to process the fact that he had killed 10 men and nearly died 3 times before lunch. This constant switching between civilization and savagery created a deep, hollow stare known as the 1,000-yard stare. You could see it in the photos of gunners from 1968 and 1969. They are young men, often shirtless due to the heat, wearing flak jackets and helmets painted with peace signs or slogans like "Born to Kill." but their eyes look through the camera, focused on something horrific that only they can see. The rules of engagement row added to the mental strain. In free fire zones, anything that moved was a target, but in other areas, gunners had to wait to be fired upon. This hesitation could be fatal. A farmer in a rice paddy might just be a farmer, or he might reach into the water and pull up a plastic-wrapped AK-47. The moment the helicopter passed, the gunner had split seconds to decide. If he shot too early, he was a murderer. If he shot too late, he was a casualty. The weaponry evolved to meet the threat. By the late 60s, gunners were modifying their pigs even further. They cut down the barrels to make them shorter and lighter. They removed the sights because they never used them anyway. Some crews even mounted minigun 6-barreled rotary machine guns, firing for 1,000 rounds per minute in the door. But the M60 remained the favorite. It was reliable, it punched through trees, and it had a distinctive, slow chug-chug-chug rhythm that sounded like a heavy hammer hitting an anvil. As the war dragged on, the NVA adapted. They stopped firing at the first helicopter in a formation. They learned to wait. They would let the lead slicks pass, waiting for the tail and Charlie, the last bird in the formation. Or they would set up flak traps, ranging heavy 12.7mm machine guns in a triangle around a likely landing zone, creating a kill box that no amount of door gunnery could suppress. Yet, through it all, the bond between the crew remained the strongest force in the war. A pilot, a co-pilot, a crew chief, and a gunner. For man in a flying aluminum can. They knew each other's voices, fears, and families. When a door gunner yelled braking left, the pilot didn't ask why he threw the stick to the left. It was a trust forged in the fires of the hot LZ, a trust that said, "I will keep the enemy off you, and you will get me home." By the dawn of 1971, the Vietnam War had mutated into something darker, grimmer, and infinitely more dangerous for the air crews. The optimistic fervor of the Air Cavalry in 1965 had evaporated, replaced by a cynical desire to simply survive the 365-day tour of duty and catch the freedom bird back to the world. But the enemy had not been idle. While American politicians spoke of Vietnamization handing the war over to the South Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese Army NVA was upgrading its arsenal. For 6 years, the door gunner's primary nemesis had been the AK-47 rifle and the heavy 12.7mm machine gun. These were ballistic weapons. You could see the tracers, you could suppress the shooter, and you could utilize armor. But in February 1971, during Operation Lam Son 719, the rules of the game were rewritten in blood. The operation was an ambitious invasion of Laos by South Vietnamese forces, supported by US Army Aviation. The goal was to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but the NVA was waiting. They had massed the greatest concentration of anti-aircraft artillery out in the history of the war. As the American helicopter armada crossed the border into Laos, they flew into a wall of steel. The skies erupted with 23mm, 37mm, and 57mm flak. A Huey door gunner, armed with a single M60 machine gun, was suddenly trying to duel with radar-guided anti-aircraft cannons, designed to shoot down jet fighters. The mismatch was grotesque. Helicopters were swatting out of the sky like flies. In just 6 weeks of operation, 107 US helicopters were destroyed and 618 were damaged. The door gunners witnessed a slaughter. They saw ships explode in midair, disintegrating into fireballs that left no survivors. They saw pilots flying crippled birds until the rotors stopped, crashing into the triple canopy jungle where NVA hunter-killer teams waited. But the true nightmare arrived a year later, during the 1970 Easter offensive. Intelligence reports had whispered about a new Soviet weapon, but few crews believed it until they saw the white smoke. It was the 9K3 Destrela II, known to NATO as the SAW-7 Grail. This was a man-portable air defense system manpads, a shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missile. For a Huey crew, the SAW-7 was a terror beyond words. The missile locked onto the intense heat of the Lycoming T-53 engine exhaust. Unlike a bullet, you couldn't dodge it by jinking left or right. The missile traveled at Mach 1.5 over 1,000 miles per hour. Once launched, it was a robotic predator that didn't stop until it hit heat or ran out of fuel. The life of a door gunner changed instantly. Their eyes once scanned the tree line for soldiers, now scanned the horizon for the telltale puff of white smoke that signaled a launch. Missile. 6 o'clock. The evasive maneuver was violent. The pilot would cut the power to idle to reduce the heat signature and bank the helicopter hard, trying to break the law. To counter this, the Army hastily retrofitted Hueys with the toilet bowl, a curved metal exhaust deflector that pushed the hot gas upwards into the rotor wash to disperse it. It helped, but it robbed the engine of power, making the already overloaded helicopters sluggish. The gunners felt helpless. Against a guy with a rifle, they could shoot back, get some. Against a supersonic missile fired from 3 miles away, they were just passengers in a falling coffin. By 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The American combat troops went home. The bases were stripped. The silence returned to the jungle, but a skeletal force remained: contractors, CIA operatives, and Marine embassy guards. The war was over, but the dying wasn't. Then came April 1975, the fall of Saigon. The North Vietnamese army rolled south, crushing the South Vietnamese defenses. Panic swept the country as the NVA tanks approached Saigon. The United States initiated Operation for Quang Nguyen, the final helicopter evacuation of American civilians and at-risk Vietnamese. It became the largest helicopter evacuation in history and the final curtain call for the Huey. The sky over Saigon on April 29, 1975 was choked with rotary wing traffic. Air America Hueys landed on rooftops. The famous image of the CIA ladder evacuation etched into history. But the real drama was offshore, where the U.S. Navy's Task Force 76 waited. South Vietnamese pilots, terrified of execution by the communists, stole any helicopter they could find: Hueys, Chinooks, even small observation birds, and loaded their families on board. They flew out to sea, searching desperately for the American aircraft carriers. The deck of the USS Midway became the stage for a surreal tragedy. There were too many helicopters and not enough deck space. Hueys were landing with fuel gauges reading empty. Door gunners, or what remained of them, often just frantic men protecting their families, leaped out as the skids hit the steel deck, but more kept coming. To clear the deck for incoming aircraft, the sailors and crew were given an unprecedented order: push them over the side. It remains one of the most haunting visuals of the 20th century. Perfectly functional UH-1 Hueys, machines that had cost millions of dollars. Machines that had been the symbol of American technological might. Machines that 58,000 Americans had died fighting for were rolled to the edge of the aircraft carrier. Sailors, tears in their eyes or faces grim with necessity, heaved against the fuselages. The heavy skids scraped against the non-skid deck. The helicopters tipped. They tumbled into the South China Sea, splashing down, rolling over, and sinking to the bottom, one after another. Splash, splash, splash. For the veterans watching on television back home, it was a gut punch. The Huey wasn't just a machine to them. It was a home. It was the thing that brought them food, brought them letters, and saved their lives. Seeing it treated like garbage was the final insult of a lost war. The war ended not with a bang, but with the sound of rotor blades fading into the ocean. The legacy of the gunner. The Vietnam War is often called the helicopter war. The U.S. Army lost over 7,000 helicopters. 3,300 of them were Hueys. More than 2,000 helicopter pilots and 2,700 crew members, gunners, and crew chiefs were killed in action. The door gunner became a cultural archetype, immortalized in films like Apocalypse Now and Full Metal Jacket. But the Hollywood image of the bloodthirsty maniac firing indiscriminately is a distortion. The reality was a group of young men barely out of high school, placed in an impossible situation, asked to protect their brothers on the ground using a machine gun tied up with a bungee cord. They pioneered tactics that are still used today. The modern Black Hawk crews flying in Iraq and Afghanistan, with their miniguns and secure harnesses, stand on the shoulders of the men who sat on their helmets in Vietnam. The concept of air assault, the ability to move an army through the sky, was written in their blood in places like the Ia Drang, Khe Sanh, and the UH Valley. But for the survivors, the war never truly ended. It lived on in the sound. Veterans speak of the Huey thump, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of the two-bladed rotor system hitting the air. It is a sound that can be felt in the chest. For a civilian, it is just noise. For a Vietnam veteran, that sound triggers an instant, visceral reaction. It brings back the smell of burning shit in the latrines, the taste of warm water from a canteen, the humidity of the monsoon, and the adrenaline of the hot LZ. It is the sound of salvation and the sound of death. The Huey is gone from the front lines, now retired to museums and boneyards. The M60 has been replaced by the M240. The jungle has grown back over the bomb craters in Vietnam. But somewhere in the collective memory of a generation, there is still a young man sitting in an open door, feet dangling over the abyss, scanning the tree line for green tracers, riding the dragon forever. If flying a slick into a hot LZ in South Vietnam was hell, flying over the fence was a suicide pact signed in invisible ink. While the nightly news reported on the war in Vietnam, a second, secret war was raging across the borders in Laos and Cambodia. This was the domain of MOCSOG Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. These were Green Berets, Navy SEALs, and indigenous mercenaries conducting top-secret reconnaissance and sabotage missions on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. For a helicopter crew, supporting SOG was the ultimate test of nerve. These missions were officially denied. The helicopters often flew sanitized, no markings, no serial numbers. The crews removed their dog tags and carried no identification. If they were shot down in Laos, the US government would deny they were ever there. There would be no rescue, no diplomatic immunity, and likely no grave. The primary aircraft for these missions was the UH-1F or the UH-1P Green Hornet, flown by the 20th Special Operations Squadron. Unlike the standard Army Hueys, these Air Force birds were modified with powerful General Electric engines, usually found in jet fighters. They needed the power because they carried a heavy load of death. The door gunners on these Black Ops birds were a different breed. They weren't just spraying and praying, they were precision instruments of survival. They carried M13 for minigun 6-barreled rotary cannons capable of firing 4,000 rounds per minute. When a minigun opens up, it doesn't sound like a machine gun, it sounds like a chainsaw tearing through the fabric of the universe. It fires so fast that every fifth round is a tracer, creating a solid beam of red light that looks like a laser. A door gunner could literally cut a tree in half to clear a line of fire. The most terrifying maneuver in the SOG playbook was the string extraction. Often, SOG recon teams, usually 6 to 8 men, would be discovered by NVA hunter battalions deep in the jungle, surrounded, out of ammo, and miles from a clearing. They couldn't cut an LZ. The helicopters couldn't land. The only option was the Stabo rig or Maguire rig. The Huey would hover 100 feet above the triple canopy jungle. The crew chief and door gunner would kick out long, heavy ropes with harnesses attached. The SOG team on the ground would clip in. Then, the pilot would pull vertical power, lifting the men straight up through the trees. For the door gunner, this was a nightmare scenario. The helicopter had to hover perfectly still, a sitting duck, while NVA soldiers poured fire at the dangling men and the aircraft. The gunner had to hang out on the skid, firing directly down between the ropes, trying to suppress the enemy without hitting his own guys who were spinning helplessly on the lines, just feet away. Once the team was clear of the trees, the helicopter couldn't stop to pull them inside. It was too dangerous. So, the pilot would fly back to base at 80 knots with 4 or 6 human beings dangling 1,500 feet below. The skids on ropes. The door gunner's job during the flight back was to watch those men. He was their guardian angel. If a rope frayed, if a harness slipped, he had to watch them fall. The psychological pressure of holding men's lives on a literal string broke even the hardest veterans. The human cost of the machine. By 1973, the shooting had stopped for most, but the internal war was just beginning. The door gunners came home to a country that didn't understand and didn't care. Unlike the World War E generation, who were welcomed with parades and ticker tape, the Vietnam vets arrived at San Francisco or Seattle airports alone. They were advised to take off their uniforms in the airport bathrooms and put on civilian clothes to avoid confrontation. They were spat on. They were called baby killers. For a door gunner, this label was particularly agonizing. These men had risked their lives to deliver food, to evacuate wounded children, and to save their friends. They had seen the worst of humanity, but they had also shown the best of it. To be branded as monsters by civilians who had never heard the crack of an AK-47 was a wound that refused to heal. The transition from the suicide seat to a desk job or a factory floor was jarring. In Vietnam, a 20-year-old gunner had the power of a god. With a touch of a butterfly trigger, he could level a village or save a platoon. The adrenaline was a drug. The vibration of the M60, the smell of JP for fuel. The brotherhood of the crew, it was an addiction to intensity. Back in the world, the US, life was gray. It was quiet. To quiet. Veterans spoke of the silence being deafening. They missed the noise. They missed the clarity of survival. Many suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD), but back then, it was just called the Vietnam blues or shell shock. They would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, reaching for a machine gun that wasn't there. The sound of a ceiling fan whopping overhead would trigger a flashback to a huddles in the UH Valley. Driving a car felt wrong because they weren't scanning the tree line for snipers. The health toll was physical, too. Door gunners had spent thousands of hours bathed in the exhaust of burning aviation fuel, and the defoliant Agent Orange, which was sprayed to clear the jungles. Decades later, these men began to die of rare cancers and respiratory diseases. The Veterans Administration fought them for years, denying that their illnesses were service-connected. The war continued to kill them long after the peace treaties were signed. The brotherhood of the rotor. Yet, despite the trauma, the bond endured. In VFW halls and reunions across America, the gray-haired men would gather. They would talk about the pig, the M60, the chicken plate armor, and the pilots who were crazy enough to fly into hell and skilled enough to fly out. They remembered the specific sounds, the metallic clack-clack of loading a fresh belt, the scream of the turbine engine winding up, the chaotic static of the radio. The lineage of the Vietnam door gunner lives on. In October 1993, during the Battle of Mogadishu Black Hawk Down, a new generation of gunners leaned out of UH-60 Black Hawks, firing miniguns to protect Rangers on the ground. In Iraq and Afghanistan, gunners on Chinooks and Black Hawks scanned the rooftops of Fallujah and the valleys of the Hindu Kush. The technology changed. The M60 became the M240 or the M134. The Huey became the Black Hawk. The flak vests became Kevlar, but the job remained the same. It is a job that requires a suspension of the survival instinct. It requires a man to strap himself to the outside of a flying machine, exposing his heart to the enemy, to protect the men on the ground. History will remember the generals and the politicians who started the war, but the soldiers will remember the sound. When the radio crackled broken arrow unit in danger of being overrun, they didn't look for a general. They looked at the sky, and they waited for the sight of a Huey banking hard, a young kid in the door hanging by a strap, unleashing a stream of red tracers into the darkness. They were the riders on the storm, and for a brief, violent moment in history, they owned the sky.